getting plenty of emails.
I'm sure you are.
Phone
I've
calls.
heard from plenty of my neighbors, trust me.
You just have to call it to order.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming to tonight's Public Safety Department City Council Budget Work Session. For those tuning in at home, we are down in the typical work session table here, and yesterday we were up for the public hearing for here today, Tuesday, May 10th. No roll call, so I'm just going to hand it over to City Manager Conard to present first the police budget and then the fire department's budget for the Little Help.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mayor. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in this evening. Tonight, you will hear from Acting Police Chief Mike Maloney and Fire Chief Todd Germain in that order. And just to set the stage, as we mentioned last night in the overview of the entire general fund budget, we mentioned specifically the request of the fire and police commissions for a salary adjustment for their collective bargaining units, which are not currently in negotiation. They're not expiring this year. So in an attempt to share with you what the folks in fire and police have shared with me, they have provided some information that speaks to comparables, if you will, information that sets us apart to the not so good relative to what other communities pay, both for starting wages and for higher up personnel. So the material on your desk tonight is reflective of that, and it really helps to paint the picture of the need for us to be more competitive in terms of recruiting and retaining staff. And I know that I've spoken with at least one counselor who is looking for that kind of information. So with thanks to both police and fire, you have that material in front of you. And with that, I'll ask Acting Chief Maloney to start us off.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here. So as the city manager noted, you do have those handouts here, but I think you also have our budget presentation in front of you. I can speak to the handouts in a little bit more detail in a little bit, but we'll just go through the presentation if that's okay at the moment. All right, you're going to come over and yell at me?
How do I make this? I'm going to make it so we can see both. Bear with me a second.
Okay. And next slide. Oh, that one's the first slide, correct. Yep. So just first to start off, that's a picture of our proposed organizational chart. Of course, everybody speaks to the police department. You're familiar with uniform officers on the street. You're familiar with detectives. But, part of our core services, in addition to patrol officers and detectives and supervisors, are, within the patrol division, we have traffic safety grants, DWI directed patrols, events and event planning, events both large and small. Unique to Portsmouth is the amount of events we have. And I think it's sometimes underestimated the manpower that it takes to manage and plan some of these events. For example, just the quick visit we had from the president a few weeks ago was 4 days of planning for ranking officers, and on game day we had 30 plus officers assigned just to that event. And at 68 sworn, that's almost half of our department that's required just to support a 2.5 hour visit. We're responsible for Pease Airport, policing Pease Airport, and also for security for domestic flights, prosecution and court preparation. In addition to that, in detectives, we are in charge of Homeland Security and anti-terrorism initiatives, cyber crimes, community engagement presentations such as citizens' response to active shooter, an investigation of fraud, scams, and elderly exploitation. And on the administrative side, with the court office, we have, in addition to the court office, which prosecutes at the district court hundreds of cases a year, we have training, recruitment, finance, CALIA, which is our accreditation, which I'll speak to in a little bit, and also our IT infrastructure. Next slide. It's important to talk about our strategic plan. This document outlines a 5-year plan for staffing and initiatives. It's a living document. It changes frequently. Items can be moved forward in and out a year or deleted completely if the initiative is no longer valid. But overall, this document guides us in our budget process. And we formalize our planning process as part of the accreditation cycle and begin producing the 5-year strategic plan to be more transparent in our initiative and staffing needs. Part of our accomplishments for FY22, we've had quite a few, including animal control officer vehicle, which was changed out from an old pickup truck, and we used one of our retired frontline cruisers for that role. We used the combination of remaining grant funds and budget funds to purchase a drone with better technology, much like cell phones. Drone technology increases and changes quite frequently, so keeping our drone unit up to date and up with all their software updates is important. We outfitted our auxiliaries with tasers. Previously, our auxiliary officers did not carry tasers, but that was important for us to make sure that everybody in uniform has that additional, less lethal option with them. We replaced a 23-year-old CERT van, which was the primary equipment van that takes equipment to Seacoast Emergency Response Team callouts, and we replaced that with Weber funds. It got to the point where the people driving the van were younger than the van, and it had to be towed from callouts on a couple of occasions, which is not convenient. For investigations, we reestablished the Family Services Unit to include a juvenile and a focus on elderly crimes. We've attended the FBI Academy, where Chief Newport is now, and we are, due to scheduling and staffing concerns, we did not send anybody to PERF, but we will be pushing that to FY23, which is a mid-management executive training course for 3 weeks for ranking officers. Not all ranking officers go, but 1 or 2 per year. We received bids to update our CAD RMS, which I'll talk about also. CAD RMS is our computer system where we input all our data. So we take a police report, we take a crash report. That's what we're talking about when we talk about CAD RMS. We have switched from Code Red to Rave, which is a software for community notifications. If there is an active incident, if there is a traffic alert, if there is a general emergency and we need to push the message out citywide, going to this new Rave system is much more user-friendly, and I think the user end of it for the city and the residents will be looking to push that online in the next couple of months. We've increased our collaboration for mental health response with our mobile crisis unit in collaboration with Seacoast Mental Health. We've improved social media to help solve crimes. We've installed cell phones in the cruisers, and part of that reason with the increase in technology and benefits to cell phones. Cell phones are replacing some of our technology, even just as far as taking a photograph at a crime scene. So we've added cell phones, and not to mention the fact that officers in the cruisers can now make phone calls from the cruisers as opposed to having to use their personal cell phone to make a work-related call without coming into the station. We installed a generator monitoring system at each radio tower site. So you may not know, but we have 8 sites throughout the city which contain our radio towers and our repeaters. If those were to go down, we upgraded the generator backup system on those so that we have a more timely notification that if we lose radio reception in one portion of the town, because we have a limited amount of time on the backup, so we increased that capability in 2022. We initiated and deployed new firearms, new duty pistols for all officers using Weber money, and we have hired 4 to 5 new officers in the last year, and we have major server upgrades in IT as well. Next slide. So as I mentioned, CALEA. So CALEA is a national law enforcement accreditation. It's a voluntary process that forces us to look at every operational and administrative function within the department on a yearly basis. There are almost 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the country, and 758 of them are accredited, and there's another 145 in process. Accreditation is become an integral part of how we operate, and we're currently in the process of our 4-year reaccreditation cycle. Each year at reaccreditation, we're required to provide over 1,000 proofs of compliance. A proof of compliance can be as simple as seatbelting a prisoner in a cruiser. So we have a policy that says we have to do that, but we also have to prove that we do that. So that could be collecting a video from our Sally Port in our booking area that shows the officer unbuckling a seatbelt from the prisoner, and that's called a proof. So there's over 1,000 proofs, from everything from unbuckling a prisoner to how we manage our IT department. Our reaccreditation on-site assessment and the four-year file review is set for February of '23. And there's two types of accreditation. There's Tier 1 and Advanced. Tier 1 is more or less an entry-level type accreditation, or an easier standard to reach. We are the Advanced accreditation, which is the gold standard, if you will. More policies, more proofs required, and it's a more thorough accreditation. We anticipate to be awarded our second accreditation certificate at that time. Next slide. Staffing challenges. In just over a year's time, we've lost dozens and dozens of years of experience. In less than a year and a half, we've lost 6 ranking officers due to retirements and other retirements, or I think it's all retirements for ranking officers. So we have 18 ranking officers, and we've lost 6 of those in the last year, which is a third of our ranking officers. So the amount of experience that's gone in just under a year and a half is quite a significant hit for us to take. We've also lost 10 non-ranking officers. So in the last year and a half, or a little bit less, we've had 16 sworn officers leave the department, which is on average a little bit more than 1 a month. We have 4 dispatchers who have resigned as well. Even administration has experienced some turnover, and we've hired 6 civilian employees for different administrative positions. Part of the challenges with recruiting, the applicant pool is very small, and it's been that way for the last few years. Applicants, pretty much a good solid applicant who can make it through a hiring process, can pick and choose where they want to go. All the police departments are requesting, competing for the same applicants. I'll interview an applicant for a job, and he'll have 2 other chiefs interviews that week. And years ago, you'd take the first job you could get, but now, because we're all competing for the same small group of applicants, it becomes increasingly difficult. And pay and incentives is part of that equation. Additional staff for FY23 that we are requesting is 2 uniform patrol officers and 1 crime analyst and patrol administrative assistant. These positions were both once approved and funded, but were lost during tight budget years citywide during times of financial crisis. It's important to point out that training a new officer can take 3 to 4 months to get through just the hiring process, and then months at the police academy, followed by a few more months of training before an officer is ready to hit the street solo. So a new non-certified candidate who has to go to the police academy, we're not seeing them on the street riding alone in a cruiser for probably 9 months. If we were to hire a lateral who's previously full-time certified, you're looking at cutting probably 4 months off of that time, where we could get them on the street sooner. The shift relief factor, it's recommended to staff up each shift 25 to 30% positions, just to cover absences such as military leaves, training, court, FMLA, long-term injury or illness, contractual leave like annual personnel. We've had a number of officers just in the last year or 2 with National Guard deployments for over a year. We had 2 that were deployed overseas, and we didn't have those 2 patrol officers for about 14 months. And we have another officer in the National Guard who is starting his workup in deployment next month, and he'll be gone for a year as well. Currently, we have a lot of forced overtime. Officers enjoy and deserve time off, and when they come to work and they're told that they have to stay 4 hours, it hurts morale over time. It puts stress on the officer. And we try to prevent that as much as possible, but quite frankly, there's a lot of forced overtime right now. The crime analyst, patrol admin position, again, those were positions that we had previously had. I shouldn't say position. We had a crime analyst before, but we see an increased demand in statistics and crime reporting, and statistics in our world drives our response to the community's issues, and it helps guide and prepare and deploy our resources more effectively. We get a lot of requests for statistics, whether it's traffic crashes, whether it's speeding complaints. Just last week, for example, at Parking, Traffic, and Safety, I had a request come in for me to look at how many pedestrian accidents over the last 3 to 5 years at a particular intersection downtown. I put it on my to-do list to have it go out, and quite frankly, we couldn't get it in time because it takes a while to pull that data, and the meeting was the following week. So having a crime analyst available to research that data and get those statistics is needed as well. They would also serve in a patrol administrative function. So patrol ranking officers have a number of collateral duty assignments, and those include everything from literally making sure we have enough forms to do our job. So a street sergeant who's backing up an officer on the street on a domestic call, that's not his only job or her job. They literally make sure we have enough paperwork and we have enough forms and arrest paperwork and search warrant forms. They run our intoxilizer machine. They keep track of our radar books to make sure our radar certifications are all up to date. That doesn't have to be a sworn officer that does that. And if we were to have this position, it would afford us the opportunity for those street sergeants and supervisors to be more active and more on the street, supervising high liability calls than making sure we have enough forms to do our job. We also are looking at replacing an aging canine unit who we have nearing the end of his career here shortly. Next slide. So I thought this was an interesting slide to put in. We talk about recruiting and retention a lot. In the last 2 years, this is where our new police officers have come from. We've never seen this type of chart before, and I thought it was interesting because we have officers from all over the country, as far west as Seattle, Washington, 2 from Colorado. And that kind of speaks to our recruitment challenges where 10 years ago, those would all be New England. We're reaching far and wide to find our candidates. A lot of these candidates are virtually all of those officers hired are full-time officers somewhere else in the country, and they're leaving some of those bigger departments for a better quality of life to live here. And they want to start new somewhere else, and thankfully they're coming here. But like I said, 10, 15, 20 years ago, they would all be New Hampshire, they would all be Massachusetts. But it kind of goes to show the challenges that we had and how far we're going out to recruit and where we're getting our officers from. In fact, there's an officer starting in a week or two who's from NYPD, and we have another one hopefully going a background from NYPD as well. Slide. Information technology in the strategic plan. There's two significant undertakings, which is our CAD RMS system and Outlook 360. CAD RMS is looking at 12 to 18 months before our live test. And again, that's the police software that we use to do police reports. If I were to take a police report tomorrow, I'm entering it in the same software that I entered it 24 years ago. So that's outdated at this point. And also Outlook 360 is our email. The city is transitioning to a different email, and we are moving to a .gov. And because of criminal justice requirements for security purposes, it requires a special type of compliance, and that's a significant undertaking with that. Objectives, we talk about the importance of training. Properly trained officers reduce the liability to the department and the city. In 2020, the governor signed an executive order based on the recommendations from the Commission on Law Enforcement Accountability and Transparency to increase the amount of training officers for all New Hampshire police officers. We are working to attain that goal of an additional 24 hours of training by 2024. Prior to that, a full-time officer in the state of New Hampshire required 8 hours of in-service training per year, but that is being moved up to 24 hours of training per calendar year. In FY22, we added to our budget the cost of 6 hours of that training. That included ethics, de-escalation, and bias-based policing. In FY23, we are adding an additional 9 for training such as mental health, crisis, and intervention response. And in FY24, we anticipate adding a final 9 hours for the 24 hours. Strategic plan objectives in 23. In the CIP, we have $400,000 over 2 years for mold and asbestos remediation, reconstruction and assembly of abated areas, air quality testing, and electrical services. In the out years in our strategic plan, additional patrol officers and detectives, potentially looking at online crime reporting, replacing a polygraph examiner who is retiring, increase our training hub capabilities, which means that we would host more training here at the police department, so in turn we would get more free seats at that training, additional command staff to attend the FBI Academy and PERF, a youth advocate, and mold asbestos remediation and reconstruction of the basement level of the police department. Some may or may not know, but we've been working for the past 2 years with the resident group representatives. To highlight a few of the things that we've worked with that group, we are working to collect and maintain more accurate encounter data. We're posting SOPs to our website, and we're conducting surveys in marginalized neighborhoods, and we're more closely examining our prosecution data. City growth. So city growth has certainly a significant impact on the city, and it has a significant impact on police services. It's easy to talk about, citizens' growth and the effects it have, but I think of, how does growth affect the police department on a day-to-day level? And I can give a couple examples of that, and I'll bring up specific projects or specific new developments, but it's not to certainly cast aspersion on any of them, but it's just to kind of give you highlights of what new buildings and people do to the police department. The Viridian, for example, soon after the Viridian opened up, we have complaints about speeders exiting water country. The officers respond to that complaint. They make directed patrols at water country. They talk to management at water country to try to have traffic calming measures upon exit. So when people leave water country, they're not speeding past the dog walking area of the Viridian. We have theft of packages in the lobby because it's a community lobby. So when Amazon drops off a package or somebody drops off a package, inevitably somebody will steal that package. Officers take an initial report. They review surveillance of the suspect. They post that suspect to social media. They identify the suspect. They see that that suspect has a long history of theft and is connected to many other thefts throughout the region. They complete warrants, including search warrants, arrest warrants, and they work with those other jurisdictions. So that one call of service generates roughly 20 hours of investigative time involving multiple officers and detectives, and that doesn't include time for prosecution in court down the road if it were to go to trial. At the West End Yards, during construction, there's burglaries of construction tools. That happens at nearly every construction site in town. Anytime something is up for construction or being built, people are looking to steal from that site. Again, it involves initial police reports, identification of suspects, search warrants, arrest warrants, dozens of hours of investigation, and that's before any residents even move into the building. When residents move into these buildings, we see the same type of calls that I mentioned, at the Viridian. A few weeks ago, a vehicle crashed into the West End Yards building, and had it never been there, the crash probably wouldn't have happened. But even that one crash calls already for traffic calming measures in the neighborhood and complaints about speed. And again, I think West End Yards, I think I said it wasn't the Viridian. But again, even before the West End Yards is fully occupied, we've already gotten calls to slow traffic down and reduce traffic in that area. Portwalk Place in the downtown, the noise complaints at bar closing. This generated dozens of calls to police to enforce the noise ordinance. In addition, police command staff and city officials met with residents and bar owners multiple times in an effort to come up to some type of resolution. Middle Hill and the Westerly Apartments on Lafayette Road and the bypass. Again, complaints about loud motorcycles, mufflers, and traffic concerns. And these residents ask for and expect the police to address these issues. Again, that's just a few examples of how the city growth directly affects us. Little history on our budget history and our budget presentation history. On February 11th, the commission held a work session on the FY23 budget. February 16th, the chief presented the police budget at our public hearing. Changes take place along the process, each step of the way, and the final submission is before you today. So the impacts of the submitted budget FY23, the overall impacts we are representing in our FY23 budget. These do include the increase of 2 officers in the crime analyst / admin position. Salaries, $149,390. That includes contractual COLA and step increases. Training, $40,345. Phase 2 of the executive order for the increased training. Insurances, $44,389. Gasoline, $21,210, increased by 30% given the current conditions. And other operating costs, $126,228, including technology, cloud-based email, enhanced investigative software, fleet repairs. The vendor rate hasn't increased. Our hourly rate for maintenance on cruisers hasn't been increased for over a decade, so that increased this year. The remaining $62,877 is for taser replacement, battery backups, biological waste, cleaning of cruisers and holding cells, training-related costs like registration, travel, and general cost of living increases in the line items for inflation. Slide. As you can see, with the total budget increase, it's a 4.8 increase over FY22. As we illustrated in the budget workshop, the police department is primarily staffing. Our other operating is only 7% of the total budget funds, and our overtime is only 5%. In our capital improvement plan, we have the following projects identified. Under buildings and infrastructure, we have 3 projects, that being land for a new police facility if needed, new police facility as outlined in the CIP hearing, the $1.4 billion for preliminary design once the prospective sites are chosen, and police deficiencies and repairs. And that's the project that will get the department by until a new facility is funded and requesting an additional $400,000 a year. Under CIP for information systems, all of our IT equipment includes rolling stock such as servers, laptops, ruggedized laptops, PCs, and things like printers and mobile radios. Also under the CIP IT is our new computer-aided dispatch and records, and the full cost of that project is estimated at $1.3 million. For rolling stock in the budget, the police department currently has 37 vehicles, which includes our patrol black and white cruisers, detective cars, animal control vehicle, as well as other police vehicles like the crime scene van, training car, and motorcycles. Vehicles are set on a replacement schedule based on use. For example, patrol cars have a 5-year life and are usually retired at over 120,000 miles, whereas detective cars can be used for as much as 10 years. We utilize some patrol cars if they have lower miles to recycle them into a detective's car. And you'll still see actually rolling around out there, we still have 2 Ford Crown Victorias, which are almost a historical police cruiser at this point, but you won't, I challenge you to try to find a Crown Vic out there. But we have 2 of them that we use as school resource cruisers, and they're kind of like an old school police car. So it's just evident in the fact that we still get the most out of our cars as we can. We use cars until they become burdensome with repairs, and in FY23 we are seeking 4 vehicles. So in closing, Portsmouth is a safe community to call home or visit. It doesn't get that way and stay that way by accident. It takes professional, thoughtful, and highly trained officers and civilian staff. In the last 2 years, policing on a national level has had more demands and calls for reform placed on it than in recent history. This, combined with recruitment and retention, has led to many challenges. In Portsmouth, we feel those effects and are responsive to the needs and wants of our community. As shown prior, I've highlighted our challenges in the last year, and we are committed to face those challenges head on. With tremendous growth in our city comes a higher demand for our services. The department's budget reflects being able to respond to those demands with the level of service and professionalism that both our residents and visitors have come to deserve and request of us. So with that said, we'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have to the best of our ability, and if there's something that we're unable to answer here, we'll certainly circle back with you.
Thank you, Acting Chief, for a thorough presentation. Are there any questions to council? Councilor Denton?
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm going to preface this by planning on asking most presenters the same question, and I know it's apples to oranges when it comes to the police department, but you had just spoke about $1.3 million for IT equipment, and I know the city is looking at essentially standing up a new IT department with 5 people in it. Is this equipment that possibly those 5 people could help maintain to save costs?
No, and I'll ask for backup on that as well, but the police department has two IT employees strictly for the police department, and a lot of that is for our servers that we need to maintain for our computer systems and our networks that exchange police information through the state and through the federal government. So I think those two kind of silos are separate in that sense with our IT.
Thank you.
Councilor Lombardi?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. First of all, it's a very good presentation. I think it was very informative. In going through the book, I noticed a couple things in terms of arrests. Things like sexual assault is up significantly. Simple assaults are up significantly, and larceny are up significantly. I guess, what do you need to address those? Do you have any sense of why that is happening, why it's increasing, and what do you need to address that?
One of the things that we found, particularly comparing statistics from years of 2020, 2021, is obviously COVID impacts. So I would say that the statistics in 2021 are more reflective of normal years as opposed to 2020, where the data for 2020 is unreliable because 2020 was such an anomaly of a year. It's tough to categorize. So I wouldn't characterize, although on paper it sure looks like there's a jump in those numbers, I would say that those 2021 numbers are now starting to return to somewhat normal based on what we saw in 2020, because we would pull statistics for any number of things, and I would go back to, if I was looking to compare something, I'd jump right back to 2019 because I wouldn't even look at the last 2 years because I couldn't rely on it. So I would say that those 2020 numbers are not, although they are an increase from 2020, but it's more returning to the norm. That said, your question still remains: what would we want to combat that? Obviously, the reduction of crime is one of our primary focuses. So, crime prevention initiatives, crime deterrence. So, simply having in the downtown area an additional officer presence where we could have 2 officers at night as opposed to 1 during our busy months. Certainly, an increased patrol down there. Increasing community involvement for building those partnerships. Obviously, all of this has the overall intent to reduce crime.
And I have a follow-up question. The other things that I see that have arisen on the Group B are drunkenness and disorderly conduct and DUI. I assume those numbers reflect similarly the change of years and the COVID.
I think when the restrictions of COVID started to loosen up, quite frankly, people forgot how to behave. And we're still even seeing it now. The increase in DWIs that we've had just so far in this year, in 2022, and we're kind of out of the time frame where the restrictions have been loosened. If you follow our Facebook or see any of our social media, the amount of DWI crashes that we've had in 2022 so far is discouraging and alarming.
Yeah.
So we have grant-funded highway safety patrols, catching those drunk drivers, arresting them more frequently, and a lot of that comes down to detecting them sooner. And if we can intervene in that sense as far as increased traffic presence, increased patrols, we already do a pretty good job of messaging out DWI awareness and prevention, but sometimes it takes more arrests to send the message.
And I have one other thing, Mayor.
Go forward.
Yeah. There was a recent New York Times article about traffic in New York City, that people are driving much faster on residential streets in New York City. And I mean, it's a situation in New York that is created a much higher death rate because of accidents with pedestrians. I know this has been a problem in Portsmouth, and I appreciate the efforts that both the Traffic and Safety Committee and Public Works and the Police Department have been doing on it. I just want to thank you for that, and keep it up.
We will, yeah. That's routinely the number one complaint we get at the police department is speed, reckless driving, dangerous driving, and it continues to be our primary focus. And if our primary focus, if the community requests that our primary focus be moved in another direction, we'll go in that direction. But until that time, the thing that I continue to hear year after year is exactly that.
Thank you.
Councilor Cook?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you as well. When I'm going through these statistics, one of the things that's really obvious to me is that the police department's doing a great job at, in effect, with more arrests for cases and responding to a lot more calls than prior. Is there a standard measure of calls per number of officer that helps you determine staffing levels ultimately?
Not that I'm familiar with. So would that be an example of how many calls an officer in any given shift should respond to?
Right.
I don't know if that's, I got written a note, but I can't read it. I don't know if, I don't know if that's a statistic we can capture, because one call could take 5 minutes, another call could take 3.5 hours. Even your most basic ground ball, run-of-the-mill DWI arrest is 3 hours worth of paperwork for an officer on a 10-hour shift. A domestic is probably 3 hours, a domestic arrest. So in some nights you can handle 20 calls for service that are quick ones, and some nights out of roll call you'll get one call and you'll work on it that entire day and then part of the next day.
Thank you. And I have one more question, and this is just an informational question. Because you talk about increased training hours. You didn't mention this type of training, but I'm curious if our police department is going to be engaging in it. Training for dealing with individuals with developmental disabilities. I know that this is something we're starting to see in Manchester and Concord.
Yep, so we do train on that currently. We do have in-house training, particularly for autism awareness, when we deal with calls for service involving adults or children with autism and our response. In fact, we have one of our ranking officers who works with a local autism center in collaboration on a continuous basis on the best practices and ways that we can respond to calls for persons in crisis like that. In fact, we have a couple of calls, a couple of well-known individuals in town who we deal with quite frequently, and we've learned the specific approach on how to deal with that person. In fact, in our computer system, when we have a resident, for example, who has autism, we're able to put notes in the computer system that an officer can read prior to arriving, which may be some key indicators of how to de-escalate or things to do or not do on that call. So that is certainly part of our training now and training in the future.
Thank you so much.
Assistant Mayor
Thank you.
and Councilor Taylor.
Thank you, Captain. Question, as we look through in the staffing needs for the 2 additional offers, one of the things I didn't see, and obviously throughout the process, had kind of hoped that we are seeing more in other communities is a mental health counselor or a social worker on staff. So I guess my question is, when we're looking at this budget and we're looking at adding more officers, is that something that's been considered in the department, is adding a mental health advocate, a social worker on staff?
Yeah, although it's not in this budget, that is certainly something that we're seeing more frequently, and that's in part with the talks with Seacoast Mental Health and the Mobile Crisis Unit. It's been done on a local level in the Seacoast region in general, but also incorporating the Mobile Crisis Unit is doing partly that right now anyway. So we'll have officers, although that person is not funded by the police department, we're not paying them. We do now respond to calls for service, and if we need a mobile crisis response coordinator, that we have a phone number we can call. It's still in the rollout process right now, but we've had instances of an officer being on a call for a mental health or a crisis-related call, and it does meet the criteria for these responders to respond. We will make a phone call, and a lot of times that they will actually come out to the scene, de-escalate, and then take the call over for us. So I think right now that's a first step. As this process starts to get more underway and people start to use this more frequently in law enforcement. So we do have that capability now in the form of the Mobile Crisis Unit, but I would certainly think future budgets that bringing somebody in-house in our department to focus on that full-time would be a benefit to the city and our residents, because we would have that person under more of our control. We wouldn't have to wait for 30 minutes. You know, they could respond sooner, but I certainly do think that's something for the future.
Thank you.
Councilor Tabor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thanks for a great presentation, Captain. And 2 comments. I'm looking at your comparable entry-level pay, and I think you've proved very clearly that we're simply not competitive on our entry-level pay. To hire an officer in Portsmouth, we pay less than Seabrook, less than Derry, less than Londonderry, substantially less than Concord and Keene. So I think you're proving your point here, and in the long run, the difficulty hiring means operating with empty positions, more overtime. It means turnover when we don't get the top quality hires that we want. And so if we invest in this, we'll lower turnover, run with fewer open positions, and actually be more efficient. So I support that. But for us as a council, we're wrestling with a needed boost to pay and 3 new positions in the same year, which gets our payroll running at a 8-9% clip. So I want to challenge some of your assumptions and for the good of the effort, hear from you on this. The calls for service, if I go back over a 6-year span of time, and 2016, 42,000, 2017, 53,000, 2018, 51,000, 2019, 49,000. So we were running significantly higher levels of calls for service before COVID. Then it falls to 33,000 approximately, and back up to 35,000 this year. So in the near term, we're seeing an increase in calls as COVID wanes, but in the long term, we were managing 49,000, 50,000 calls a year with a sworn force of 68 officers. So now we want to go up to actually 66 sworn officers in 2019. So now we want to go up to 70 plus 1 civilian. am I missing something here? It would seem that the tempo pre-COVID was significantly higher, and we were doing it without those extra positions.
Can I see what you're reading from? Is that in the budget book?
I went back to the prior year's budget books,
Oh, okay.
and I know that there's flaws with the system that you have, and it's very imperfect, but I would assume it's comparable between years, because
Okay.
it's the same software.
I would, in first part, to mention to your mention about the salary. So you did get the handout, and like I spoke to during recruitment retention, you can see kind of where we fall with the entry-level patrol officer pay, the 10-year patrol officer pay, and that's why I say, a good qualified candidate can just interview 3 to 4 places a week and then shop for where they want to work. And I think those charts kind of reflect where we're at on our pay scale. With respect to the new positions, I would state that they're not new positions. They're positions that we once had that were not funded. So we're not trying to add to a total that we didn't have before. I think it was a 71 or 72 we had in 2007. So by officer, 69, 70. I would also say those calls for service, or some of those are officer-generated calls for service. So when you see those numbers that, a call for service could be an officer generating a traffic stop, an officer generating an activity on their own. And I would say that, part of the reason why some of those numbers are lower is it's not necessarily a response for a call for service, but it could be something that an officer, him or herself, generates. And if we don't have the officers to generate some of those numbers, it's going to reflect in the numbers. So by virtue of the fact that you have less officers, you're going to have less property checks. You're going to have less directed patrols. You're going to have less traffic enforcement. So that could speak to certainly some of that decline, or that lower number going back 5 or 6 years does coincide with the fact that we do have a lower number of officers in those years. But there's so many different things that contribute to calls for service. It's tough to kind of judge. Using calls for service to dictate staffing levels wouldn't just be it's not a one-for-one. If it's not a simple algorithm of you have this many calls for service, you should have this many officers, because we could have lower numbers of calls for service some year, but we could have twice the amount of events that require police activity. We have a women's march a few years ago that was billed for 500 to 750 people that turned into 5,000. That's not a call for service, but that's something that required 25 cops to work. So I completely understand if X, Y, but there's a lot of different variables in there where simple calls for service doesn't completely reflect the need for police services.
Well, just to maybe make it simpler, what does the community get for this investment in 2 new patrol officers and a crime analyst?
So when I talked about what a call for service sometimes entails, so a simple theft report, you have an officer who may be tied up for an entire investigation, 15 to 20 hours. We have one officer that works that side of town. That officer is now not working that side of town because they're doing a call for service or a call for a job. If we're able to increase our presence, we're able to backfill that vacancy that officer just created. So that next call for service that comes in, there would be a shorter, response time for it. You would be able to have additional staffing to replace staff that's not there. It would decrease the amount of forced overtime, hence having more rested officers that are not getting ordered in 3 days a week when they come to work. So, you have an officer who's more refreshed. You have an officer whose morale is better. You have an officer who can take a day off if they want it. Currently our our current day shift, the only time of day and the only weekday that an officer can take off without incurring overtime is 1 day a week. So 6 out of 7 days a week, if somebody wants to go home now on day shift, the answer is no, because we don't have the personnel to backfill it. So, the city may not get anything out of having an officer have a day off, but they might have an officer who's more well rested the next day they're at work. So,
If I could, one,
Sure.
is that 6-day schedule due to unfilled positions?
no, I mean, out of a 7-day work week, if you look at the schedule, 6 out of those 7 days, there's no flexibility to give anybody a day off. Only 1 day a week on that shift are you able to give somebody a day off.
Okay. I was just curious whether that's due to open positions. I mean, if you were fully staffed, would you still have to have that? schedule?
You'd have a lot less of that, maybe 3 days a week. Because again, somebody's on, an officer on that shift may be on military deployment for a year or paternity leave. Whereas if you had that flexibility, you had that additional manpower, you would still be able to backfill that.
Okay, great, thank you.
Counselor Denton.
Thank you, Your Honor. To follow up on Counselor Tabor's question regarding staffing, several years ago, Chief Mara and then Chief Murner looked to flatten the department. The numbers which you're requesting, would that complete the flattening of the department?
I believe the flattening was specific in terms of ranking officers, not department in general, not non-ranking. It wouldn't. We've successfully flattened the department going back a few chiefs now based on a internal review that was conducted, but we wouldn't be adding any ranking officers positions with these 2 new officers. So in a sense, it would continue to flatten, but that was specific to ranking officers.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Counselor Bagley.
Thank you, Your Honor. I've got a couple of questions. The first one, as a council member on the Parking, Traffic, and Safety, I probably hear more from residents than the rest of the council. Why aren't the police out there doing more traffic stops? For clarity of, just for everybody at home, when we do a traffic stop and we write a ticket, all the cost is, our police force, but where does that revenue go?
It goes to the police academy.
It goes to the police academy, so not to the town.
None.
So we don't retain any of that revenue in the
Zero.
city. So that's just, I wanted to say that for the people at home, that, if we do more traffic stops, it may help slow people down, but it's not going to offset any of the costs that we maintain the police department with. The second, I kind of want to follow up on the assistant mayor's question. The work you're doing with Seacoast Mental Health, that seems very timely, and I'd like to encourage that. If I understand correctly, we're not actually funding any of that? How does that
Correct.
work exactly?
Nope, we're not funding it. It's a collaborative effort working with Seacoast Mental Health and the state, but we're not funding any of that. Basically, the way that would work was if we respond to a call for service, which we respond to multiple mental health crisis-related calls in a given day, there's a certain parameter and a certain prerequisite that if the call involves this type of behavior, if there are no weapons involved, if it's just perhaps a suicidal but nonviolent individual, if it meets a number of those criteria, which a lot of ours do, it then becomes eligible for a mobile crisis unit response. Then we would call mobile crisis unit from the scene. The officer would explain to them the circumstances of what was happening, and then we would request a caseworker to come to the scene for us so that we can then transition over the call and care and custody of the individual to more appropriate resources, that being mental health professionals, but it does not come out of our budget.
And just to follow up on that, how long have we been working with this relationship? Is this relatively recent?
Yeah, it's been it's a slow rollout. It is an initiative that we are working with right now. We do use the mobile crisis unit on a daily, if not weekly basis, but it's been within the last year. It's been a slow build out. It's the entire state that's doing it. It's not just here. So it's a brand new initiative. It's a new program, and as benchmarks get met and as bugs get worked out, you'll see more of a 24-hour response as opposed to a daytime response where you'd have crisis workers that can come out at all hours and available at all hours of the day. But it's a relatively new initiative in the last year and a half. But since it's a statewide initiative, it's been a little bit of a slow rollout, but we're working very closely with Seacoast Mental Health locally for our piece of it.
That's great to hear. And then, Your Honor, my final question. There's a position that's not funded. That's the youth advocate position. What is that exactly? And with everything we've just been through with COVID, is that something that you might think we really need at this time?
Yeah, so the youth advocate position is a civilian position that we had until, I'm not sure how long. Yeah, probably 2004, 2005. It's a civilian position that's assigned to the Family Services Unit that specifically works with juveniles who are eligible for diversionary programs. So alternatives to court sanctions, alternatives to juvenile petitions where you're sending a juvenile to court. The youth advocate would be an intervention step where it would be an intermediary response between holding a juvenile accountable and perhaps diverting them or finding some other alternative other than a court-imposed discipline best suited for that individual. And a lot of times with juveniles, it's a very important part of their developmental process. It's an important part of their age, and it's critical to intervene with the most amount of resources properly for individual juveniles because you could steer a kid away from a life of crime if you handle it right when they're 12, 13, 14, as opposed to just petitioning to court and then they're in front of a judge. That sometimes that can do more harm than good. So having that youth advocate that's able to work a little bit more closely, and it's also a civilian position. It's not a police officer, but they do work for us and they carry our message, but it may be well received better from a civilian than a detective, with a badge and a gun. So we've seen great success with that. We had that position for many years, so that would be a position that we would look to request back.
Okay, yeah, I guess on the council, maybe our job is usually to find places to cut things from the budget, but this seems like something, at least from my perspective, having a young child who's gone through the COVID experience, that youth advocacy is going to be very important over the next 3 to 5 and probably even longer years. So if that's something that's a need of the police department, I hope we consider it.
Okay.
It is in the strategic plan in an out year.
Okay, great.
Going to get boots on the ground right now.
Thank you.
Councilor Blaylock.
Thank you, Your Honor. And thank you, Deputy Chief Captain Maloney, for his presentation. So I see the value in eliminating the forced overtime. The crime prevention obviously is huge. Being efficient as possible, and also I can see the retention of officers, losing 60 officers and several dispatchers. And I can see where that would just add cost and more training and be very inefficient. With that said, without affecting services, what is there anything that you could cut if without affecting services, without affecting all the things that I just mentioned in this proposed budget? If you had to cut something, or is this is what we need, this isn't a perfect world presentation?
This is what we would, request. I don't know what the chief would say to me if he told me, if I said that we would want to cut something. That could be one of those questions I said I'd get back to you on. But I would say probably the 2 full-time officers would be a priority over a civilian position. However, I think in culmination of the 3 positions that, going into this budget, I know that the approach from the chief and the chief staff was that to not put in something that we don't need. And we wouldn't put something in there simply as a bargaining chip, knowing that we would lose it if we needed to.
Thank you. And just one other question. I know you mentioned that that other civilian position where they could actually save the department money, where they could do checking radar guns, doing statistics and stuff like that, where you wouldn't have a full-time officer taken away from his job and doing that. So that actually would be efficient for the department as a whole, correct?
Correct. Yeah. I run stats on a regular basis, and I probably shouldn't. But I'm one of the people that knows how to use the computer system probably better than anybody because it's quirky. And I shouldn't be running stats based on what I'm doing. And I hate not being able to be responsive to the needs of the community. So when parking traffic and safety asks me for data on an intersection, it bothers me that I can't get it to them in 5 days. But the fact of the matter is I look around and see where I could maybe farm that out and get that done, and I have nowhere to farm that out to. So it's, as far as presenting a professional work product forward, I don't like to disappoint people who ask things of us. And that's hard to do sometimes. And I tried to get that stat, but I was preparing for the budget and I just couldn't do it. So we would become more efficient with the addition of that, absolutely.
Thank you.
Assistant Mayor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, Captain. Quick question as I'm going over some line items here. When I look at, say, general patrol and we look at professional services, we're looking at a request of 3 times to the last 2 prior budgets. It's page 287. So just to get clarity on a couple of things. So that, and then throughout pretty much the whole department, we're seeing not large requests, but anywhere from, as it adds up through each individual department within the department, roughly $20,000 to $25,000-ish of an increase in clothing allowances. So just questions of that. Is that just the general now cost increase of uniforms, of launder and that of?
Are you doing the clothing allowance or the clothing line?
Clothing allowance.
So that's
Karen, you need the mic.
That's, sorry.
Can we back up to the
Yes.
first one? Yeah, professional services?
Yes.
On page 287?
Yes,
Under general patrol.
yes.
That's New England trauma.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it right here. On, where is it, Karen?
It's about halfway down.
You're looking under professional services under patrol?
Yeah, so basically I was just going essentially line by line and much like
Oh, there it is.
Councilor
Yep.
Tabor did, comparing relative to the last 4 budget cycles and just anyone, even if they were minuscule, obviously that's our job to look at and kind of ask why.
Yep. So we learned under COVID, we had a number of officers during the early days of COVID that would come down with COVID and then be in a police cruiser, and then we would have to decontaminate the cruiser. And we found that asking our civilian part-time mechanic to decontaminate and disinfect police cruisers was inefficient and not fair to that person.
Yeah.
So we've contracted out New England Trauma Services, which is a biohazard cleaning company. So we have police cruisers that become contaminated with bodily fluids, or a number of other different things that contaminate a cruiser. Previously, we had, again, our civilian garage mechanic clean that cruiser. Same thing with a police cell that becomes contaminated with bodily fluids. Historically, city janitorial staff would take care of that. So the increase is to pay for a professional biohazard cleaning company to come in and do that, rather than subjecting our civilian staff who's not trained or equipped to deal with that. So that's that increase.
Thank you. And if you wouldn't mind, I guess for some of us, explaining the difference between the line items of clothing allowance and clothing.
You want to do that, Karen?
Yeah, sorry. Clothing allowance is contractual.
Okay.
It's in their collective bargaining agreement. In terms of clothing, we do outfit, I budget for about 3 officers to be outfitted. It costs about $3,600 to outfit an officer. And that would be the clothing. If they damage their uniform on duty, we pay for that. So that's the difference between clothing allowance and clothing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And one more question, if you don't mind. Skipping over to page 290. As you said, I think throughout the roll-up, was it 6 vehicles?
4. There's 4 in the CIP?
4.
4
Correct.
in the CIP.
In the rolling stock.
In rolling
rolling stock,
stock,
I'm sorry.
sorry. I said rolling out, my apologies. In the fleet maintenance, we have a dramatic jump there too. So if there's a little, I don't know if that's you,
Yeah,
Captain or Karen.
Fleet maintenance, I went over that kind of real quick. So We take our cars to get serviced at a local Ford dealership. The Ford dealership had not increased its hourly rate for service in 10 years. So they finally did increase their hourly rate to change oil, realign a cruiser, fix a transmission. So that increases to accommodate the change in that service fee.
Okay.
I was going to say, he called and he says, we're actually operating in a deficit for you guys. But the thing is they
Based on that
also-
jump, I assume they were.
And they also take our cars immediately. We don't wait. Everybody else gets bumped, our cars get done, so.
Okay. Thank you for answering those questions.
Counselor Cook?
Thank you again. Sorry to follow up with another question. I noticed the overtime percentage in the budget is around 5%. What is that reduction from? Like, what percentage are we at now? And I noted that the overtime pay doesn't change significantly in the budget itself. It's pretty similar to last year, even though we're anticipating a reduction in overtime by adding a few officers. Is that just because of pay rates, or? Yeah, and then I have another.
Yeah, I was going to say, on our overtime, basically, we track everything by hours. That's the only way to do things out, apples to apples. So yes, the rates go up, but then we have, as the chief said, we had 15 retirements or people who left, so rates do go down on that.
Okay.
Based on the number of hours. We have hours tracked back to 2001. And we basically do like a 10-year kind of rolling average of what we need, and then take the median or the average.
And I guess the follow-up on that is, we talk about forced overtime, but you also probably have patrol officers that have become reliant on overtime to supplement income.
Nope.
No?
Do you want to speak to overtime?
I'd like to hear the rest of the. Was there a rest of the question?
Yeah, I was just wondering how many of our officers see the overtime as supplement to income, and will we see a change in that when we have increases in salary rates?
I was going to say, our overtime is all generated by the supervisors, pretty much. You have to ask a supervisor if you're going to stay in detectives late to work on a case. In patrol, they're all pre-done by the supervisor staff as they look at the daily rosters. So there is no manufactured overtime or overtime that somebody would get used to. We do have a lot of people who like to work overtime and a lot of people who don't like to work overtime. So somebody might get 20,000 one year, whereas their coworker only gets 5,000 in overtime. It's basically, they sign up for the patrol overtime. Detectives, it's based on the case investigation. So it's kind of very difficult to try and get used to doing any overtime unless it's offered.
Thank you.
No other question? Oh, one more?
To piggyback a little bit on Councilor Cook's question, could we assume that there would be a potential reduction in overtime expenses with new hires?
Yes,
Of that
it won't
line.
be hour for hour.
Okay.
Because if a police officer will come in, they will get a shift. On that shift, you would see a reduction in overtime because they would be.
Sorry, the
You
microphone.
would see a reduction if the new officer came in on a shift. On that particular shift, you'll see a reduction because they might be a TBA or whatever. But on all the rest of the shifts, if there's no officer there, you're still going to see the same amount of overtime. Okay.
Thank you, guys. I just had two questions, if there's not any other from the council. Maybe let's start one. First, on the IT side of the house, there's certainly a lot of work that your department does that has to be firewalled from the rest of the city. But when you mention things like, moving to Outlook, something that the city uses, I hope there would be a understanding when it comes to help desk and administrative tasks like that could be overseen by a potential office of the chief information officer to investigate those where there could be potential efficiencies. So that's a comment. And again, with your request around data, I think that these are going to be some of the, and pulling your data yourself, you know, Acting Chief Maloney, I definitely would agree with the sentiment that you should not be pulling data and working in spreadsheets. I'm sure that you are fantastic at that and know the quirky computer. But I think as a city, as we grow, we're going to have a greater need for data and see interdepartmental data, you know, PTS and the police department, fire department. Seeing that work in less silos would be something that I hope we can see more broadly as a city, and that comment is directed at this department, but also in terms of general government. The other question I had, and this goes back to the staffing, we now have a deputy chief in this. This is a new role.
Correct.
And could you speak at all to the new role of the deputy chief and what you're hoping to accomplish with that role?
Yeah, we had a deputy chief for a number of years, and then that deputy chief's position was turned into a captain, so we had 3 captains. The chief's going to go all night with the microphone. I should have just taken this an hour
We're
ago.
going to play
and
the
went like
CIP
this.
for one more microphone here.
We had a deputy chief before and 2 captains, and that deputy chief's position was downgraded to a captain, so we had 3 captains. That was done under Chief Mara. Chief Newport has seen the benefits of having a deputy chief position for strategic planning, succession planning, and overall management of the police department. So the request is that the deputy chief position be refunded again for those reasons, and the reasons that that position exists for probably 15 of the 24 years that I've been here anyway. In that organization chart in there does reflect that deputy chief position.
Okay,
correct.
and then the administrative, so previously it was the captain of the investigative division, captain of the patrol division, and previously there was a captain of the administration division, or is that how that's
Correct.
right? And that's going to, who is the administration division?
It'll be the deputy chief.
Okay, so the deputy chief is going to be then in charge of the
Correct.
administrative.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. And I believe I also got a note, I was able to read it, that Chief Newport is dialing in from running around the forests of Quantico in his training, and he would like to say a few words, if that's all right.
He's the chief. What do I do with this now? I just figured it out.
Chief Newport.
I miraculously appeared.
We can hear you.
They hear me okay. I can't figure out how to get a camera on here, but at least as long as you can hear me. First, I'd like to thank Acting Chief Maloney for stepping up and making this presentation for me on my behalf. He's done a great job. I think he's been very thorough. And you guys have been good in asking some very good questions. I think he's been able to answer most of them. There's some that I could add some additional comments on. Starting with the deputy chief position, as Captain Maloney's already stated, that looking back over our past and seeing different administrative structures, I feel that the deputy chief position allowed us to have the best span of control and allow us to succession plan and provide the best overall management of our department and for our supervisors. So that's why I plan to go back towards that. Previously, when we did have a deputy, we still had an admin captain, and we had one captain that was in control of patrol and detectives, and that seemed to be overwhelming. Actually, it was overwhelming because I was that person at the time. So I feel a better benefit is now to have a captain over detectives and a captain over patrol, and have the deputy chief absorb the majority of the admin captain positions. I've been taking notes listening to you guys, so I'll just go in reverse order. Mayor, as far as the IT stuff and the email and the Outlook, we currently have that role with Outlook now. Of the city manages it for us and the city. But when we transfer over to, I think, to 360, from the information that's been provided to me, we are going to go to a .gov, but I believe the rest of the city is not. And currently, with us going to a .gov, we will be in charge of managing our own email. So I don't know if there's potential in the future for the city to manage that, or we'll be managing it on our own. The overtime, as Captain Maloney explained, this really all goes back to the manning positions and us asking for the extra bodies. Part of that is a new focus on officer wellness, and Captain Maloney had already mentioned that about people being ordered over and working extended hours. And Councilor Tabor had mentioned, going back some years, we were doing more service of calls with less people, but again, the number of calls changes depending on the type of call. We're dealing with a lot more mental health calls now than we were then, and the calls are a lot more time sensitive and take longer to get through than some of the calls we were dealing with back then. Having those additional officers gives us that relief that we do not have now. What we've been doing now and maintaining for the last 2 years is not sustainable. I think our officers are almost at a breaking point now. Yes, they're working a lot of overtime because we're a little bit of short staff because we have some openings. But in addition to, we're always going to have that opening. It's very rare that we're completely fully staffed, but it doesn't take into account when people are out for training, people are out injured. We've had, like Captain Maloney stated, we've had some long-term deployments that will continue. And if you go back into those early years, we had enough relief officers. Even with the 66, we had like 35 officers patrol, where we're like right now, going forward, looking at like we only have 31 officers in patrol because of staffing shortages for people being out for different reasons. So having those additional bodies will allow us to have that relief and back. In addition to that, the number of calls for service could be reduced with the additional staffing out there because we'll be more proactive rather than reactive. And we can prevent calls because we can make more of a presence. And part of what we've done in the last 2 years is that being more of a presence. Why you see some of our numbers are going down is because we're being more visible to prevent calls from happening rather than being more reactive like we were in the past. On the youth advocate, that's something we've had in the past. It's something that, as Karen Senecal had mentioned, that we have in a strategic plan that we'd like to bring back, and it's a diversion program. Again, another program to be proactive rather than reactive. As well as the mental health position that Councilor Bagley was talking about. That also is something that we've been talking about in our strategic plan and looking at in an out year, possibly next year. But we've also been looking at the crisis team, as Captain Maloney has stated, and seeing how that system works and see how the two can complement each other. And I think that's it, unless you have any other further questions for me.
Thank you, Chief Newport. I think that is all the questions we have. Again, didn't read it, but love the mission of the police department. The Portsmouth Police Department actively works in partnership with the community to protect, prevent crime, and respectfully, justly, and compassionately help all people. Community commitment, compassion. Really appreciate all the work that you've done. It feels like in some ways COVID is in the rear view. It's certainly the effects of that will be felt by our community for many years to come. Appreciate all the work that the police department has done to be there for us in a time when there was a lot of difficult challenges, both physical but also mentally in our community, and appreciate the work that you do every day and the work you do putting together this presentation. So thank you, Acting Chief Maloney and Karen Senecal, for a great presentation and answering our questions this evening.
Okay. Thank you, Ron. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Your Honor, we'll switch gears and bring up Fire Chief Germain.
Oh, and thanks to the work of the Police Commission. Appreciate this.
Yours. Yours. Paying attention.
I'm working on it. Give me 1 second.
Well, good evening, Mayor McEachern, and City Manager Conrad, and City Councilors. Be here in front of you tonight to present the Fire Department's FY23 budget proposal. Start off just a recap of our the essential services that we provide the city and the citizens of Portsmouth. Obviously, fire suppression, 911 ELS emergency response. Included in that are, of course, car accidents, technical rescue, and any other type of medical emergency situations. Hazardous materials and disaster mitigation response. We're responsible for emergencies in the marine environment, along the waterfront and the confines of Portsmouth. Our fire prevention inspection activities, emergency management, the Seabrook Station drills that we do every other year, and of course, most recently, our response to the COVID-19 pandemic and testing and vaccine clinics and such. And then community services and community engagement, and that's really, all the other things that we're called upon in the course of our daily routine. It doesn't fall into any of the other categories. Our department organization, as it stands today, I report to the Board of Fire Commissioners, and then under me is we have our administrative manager and budget coordinator. Further down the tree, Assistant Chief McQuillan is our Chief of Operations and Training. He's also responsible for fleet maintenance, buildings and grounds maintenance, and licensure. Reporting to him is our part-time mechanic, and then of course the four individual shifts, A, B, C, and D, that are made up of a shift commander or a captain and 2 lieutenants and 12 firefighters spread amongst the 3 fire stations in the city. On the other side of the tree is Deputy Chief Howe. He's the Deputy Chief of Prevention and all the community risk reduction activities, which include code enforcements, inspections, fire investigations, and fire and public education. He has 2 fire inspector prevention officers that work for him in that division. And that's our tree. That's it. Our position summary for FY23 is essentially the same except for one small change. We have one less part-time position. We had a person that was a billing clerk that assisted with calling information and working with our third-party ambulance biller for ambulance billing and follow-up collections. Our third-party biller changed the way that they do their activities, and they're able to get most of that information from the hospital now instead of relying on us to provide it to them. There's a little bit left over of a responsibility on our end, but it certainly wasn't enough to justify an entire part-time position. So we were able to eliminate that position, and the remainder of that work is being absorbed by our administrative manager. That position, nobody lost their job. That position became empty last summer, and we were absorbing most of that work anyway, so we've just decided not to include it in this year's budget. Our goals have remained largely the same as with most fire departments in the world, and we maintain and strengthen the reliable delivery of our essential and critical emergency and non-emergency services, promote the safety of our community and employees through comprehensive education and training, provide effective, efficient, and customer-centered services, and minimize the risk of life and property loss through our proactive planning, education, and enforcement of the applicable codes and standards. And pretty much encompasses both sides, the operations and the prevention side of our business. Efficiency. So there's always a lot of talk in our, it seems to me in the last few budgets that I've done here, that there's a lot of talk about efficiencies and what can we do as a department to do as much or more work with the amount of people that we have. And I would argue that in our fire department, we've been doing this for quite some time. And just as some examples that I was able to pull out here, and I explained this in the last year, but for the benefit of most of the new council, I kept it in here for this year as well. We have administrative duties that we have assigned to our line officers, our captains and lieutenants. And in the fire department, the way we work, the chief officers, myself and Assistant Chief McQuillan and Deputy Howe, and the 2 fire prevention officers are really the only administrative people that we have. We're the only ones that actually, for the most part, sit in an office and do our work at a desk. And the captains and lieutenants are all assigned to shifts. They're assigned to trucks. They respond to calls. You know, they work their shift work. That's their primary responsibility. But we've assigned them administrative duties as well as their assigned shift responsibilities. And part of those duties, you know, each officer has, you know, one of these as I list here. One's a training coordinator, which is a big one. There's 2 of them, training coordinator, one for fire and one for EMS. As you can imagine, we're constantly having to train. These skills are very perishable, and if we don't keep up on them, then they do go away. EMS quality assurance and quality improvement. We have an officer assigned to inventory management for all of our EMS supplies. We do almost 3,500 ambulance calls a year, and the supplies needs to be managed. We have one of our fire prevention officers liaisons with the IT department for information technology. He doesn't really do any IT, but he liaisons with the IT department to keep our computers in line and for upgrades and so on. We have an officer assigned to just maintaining the diagnostics and hazard detection calibration equipment, which is very important to us. It's the devices that we use to sense carbon monoxide, cyanide, hydrogen sulfide, or chlorine gas, among the big ones. And we need to make sure that those obviously are on point. If they're not, it puts everybody in a dangerous spot. We have a person responsible for SCBA maintenance and management. That's a occupational health requirement that we have records on the maintenance and the upkeep of those and the daily checks of those. And those are our air packs that we use to breathe in the fires. We have an officer assigned to technical rescue equipment management and maintenance. As you're well aware, a few years ago got a heavy rescue truck, and it has several $100,000 worth of specialized rescue equipment in it, and this officer is responsible for maintaining that equipment and also training all of our firefighters and officers on how to use it. And then we have an officer that manages our protective clothing and make sure that we don't have a set that's older than 10 years old by FDA standards, and also manages the replacement and repair of all that equipment. And again, that's an occupational health requirement. And those are requirements in the event that if something happened to a firefighter, that they would want the records of all these to make sure that they're maintained. So it's important that we have to do that. But again, all of these duties are assigned to officers who also respond to emergencies, manage their respective shifts, and conduct training and so on. And in many departments close by to us, and really around the fire service, these responsibilities are absorbed by an officer that's all they do. That's their administrative job. And they're lieutenants or they're captains, and sometimes some departments they're chief officers. So that would require an additional position in our department. And we could certainly, if you were giving it to us, we would take it. But we're managing quite well with the system we have here now. But to point out, in a lot of departments, that's another $100,000-$200,000 worth of position. Continuing on, our administrative manager budget coordinator, Tracy Freeman. She's our administrative staff. She provides the executive support for all 3 of the chief officers, the 4 captains, and the Board of Fire Commissioners. She administers the payroll, tracks payables and expenses, tracks and updates the budget daily, coordinates with federal, state, and local grant activity, files and tracks our workers' comp claims, tracks the use of department leave. If we ever get part-time personnel back, she would supervise them. Assists myself as the EMC in running the Emergency Operations Center, and again, she's absorbed the what's left of the third-party ambulance billing services. Continuing on with our efficiencies, which we're quite proud of in the fire department. we have an in-house firefighter that we use, or in-house off-duty firefighter that we use for routine vehicle maintenance scheduling. Does the minor stuff, light bulbs, oil changes, and so on, but the major stuff for liability purposes, brakes and so on, schedules with the vendors in our area to maintain our vehicles, which obviously is very important. We're unable. It's very hard to lease or rent a fire truck or an ambulance if something were major to happen to one. Unlike construction equipment, I'm sure it's probably easier to get, but weren't able to do that. And finally, we're I think, as far as I'm aware, we're the only department in the city whose buildings aren't maintained custodially by the city Department of Public Works. We do it ourselves. Our own on-duty personnel. It's three stations, 9 offices, 13 bathrooms, 3 kitchens, and over 11,000 square feet of garage space is maintained by on-duty personnel. And not that that's unique to us. It's ubiquitous in the fire service, and it has been for, I think, many, many, many years. And I think it's a holdover from 50 years ago when, fire departments, firefighters just went to fires, and there weren't that many of them. They weren't daily, that's for sure. And in their spare time, they maintained the buildings and did the custodial work in the buildings. That's not the way it is anymore. Our firefighters and officers are pretty busy from the time they get there and they put their gear on the truck and get their equipment checked, get the training done, tool maintenance and so on, and then, the up to 5,000 emergency runs that they respond to a year. I think, again, to point out that, if we were another department in the city, this is another couple full-time positions that the city's paying for to maintain our buildings. Next slide are calls for service trends. Much like Councilor Tabor pointed out with the police department, from 2015 up to 2018-19, that it kept getting higher and higher every year, and then our COVID years hit, and we took a dip, but you can see that they're starting to trend back up in 2021, and 2022 is on pace with 2021 up through the first quarter. You see the red line is fire only, and blue is ambulance only, and the yellow, it doesn't add up to those other two because it's total runs, and some of them that include both fire and ambulance response, such as a car accident or a serious medical aid call. But again, just to show that we're trending back up out of the COVID years. The next slide speaks to the fact that we do generate revenue for the city through our ambulance billing and collections. It had trended upward for many years until FY in 21, and again, because of the impacts of COVID, because FY 21 encompasses a lot of the months where there was such a decline in calls and therefore a decline in revenue. But we expect that to climb back up again with the ambulance responses as they increase as well. Next page is the budget summary snapshot, and I pulled this out and just to point out that basically everything in the top half, the contractual obligations, is just that. It's contractual or legislatively driven in the case of retirement costs, things that we are obligated to pay for, and it's 94, a little over 94% of the entire budget, which leaves us a little less than 6% for essentially what is overhead. Which the top half is the people and paying for them, and the bottom half is what it costs to keep them on the trucks and the stations open and the vehicles running. You can see in the top half there's the reduction of the part-time billing clerk, and in the lower half and the other operating, it's a total of $23,000 that's increased over last year's FY22 budget. Which brings me to our request for this year of $10,149,433, and it represents a $333,000 or 3.39% increase over FY22. The effects on the budget for this year, the significant effect is an increase in our shift coverage account of $98,480, and that's in an attempt back in 2019 when I first became the chief. We were authorized to hire an additional firefighter per shift, to go from 14 to 15 firefighters per shift. And that was the beginning of a 5-year plan to eventually have a staffed engine or ladder truck, as the case at Station 2, and a staffed ambulance in all 3 of our stations 24 hours a day. To do that, we would need a maximum of 16 firefighters on duty with a minimum of 15. Right now, we're still only able to carry 13 minimum, even though we're staffed for 15, because we haven't yet reached that level of 15 per shift. I was authorized to hire them back in 2019, and we still haven't gotten there yet because of retirements, resignations, and we've had to let a couple of people go. So, and again, to Acting Chief Maloney's point, the recruitment is just as difficult for us. We're having the same problem. So, again, this 5-year plan began in 2019. It was derailed for 2 consecutive fiscal years by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're hoping to get it back on the rails again. This is an incremental increase. To do what we want to do, to staff all 3 fire stations with an ambulance and an engine, would cost close to, or probably more than $500,000, and we understand that that's not going to happen in 1 fiscal year. So we need to incrementally do that over a period of time. This is a hope to be able to get back on track. This won't allow us to get to that point where we can staff the ambulances, a 3rd ambulance, for even part of the time, but it does get our minimum staffing from 13 to 14 as much as possible. And if we eventually are able to fill these positions that are vacant, I think we have 4 left to fill, it'll be easier to reach the minimum of 14 staffing, because we'll have that buffer that's basically a floating position on each shift. So that's and it's the first measurable increase for this purpose in 3 fiscal years. And I'll also point out that this budget doesn't ask for or propose any new programs or positions, but does maintain the current level of service, stations, and resources that we have already. Our strategic plan is pretty much the same, and just as I spoke to, obviously continue to strengthen and maintain the high level, reliable delivery of essential emergency and non-emergency services, but to eventually provide 1 staffed truck and 1 staffed ambulance in each of our 3 geographic response zones or stations in the city at all times. And then, therefore, to do that, we need to appropriately fund the salary and the benefits and shift coverage lines to ensure that those 15 on-duty firefighters are there 24/7. That's the bulk of of my presentation. Certainly open for questions, and I can certainly speak to the recruitment and retention and the request for the 4% as well, if need be. So.
Thank you, Chief. Councilor Bagler.
Thank you, Chief, and thank you, Your Honor. Looking at the sheets, it's pretty clear to me that we got an outstanding fire department that's woefully underpaid compared to peer fire departments in the region. I think it'd be hard to make an argument otherwise. Just the numbers don't lie. Not a question, but I do want to call attention to the 22 school public outreach visits that the fire department did, in addition to the 5,000 COVID-19 vaccines that were administered to people that were unable to travel to the vaccination sites, along with 1,000 COVID-19 tests. I think the fire department, all the departments had to step up because of COVID, but I certainly think the fire department did an outstanding job in that regard, and I don't think it should go unmentioned. Thank you.
I'm very proud of the men and women of our department that stepped up when need be, and the biggest step up they did was when the vaccines became available and they needed people to staff these vaccine clinics. And what better group than us? We had the skill set, and they had the drive to do it and the want to do it. And to your point, we administered within the city alone over 5,500 vaccines to vulnerable adults, older adults, and younger, more vulnerable, medically vulnerable people. And regionally, when they opened the regional vaccine clinics, and they became harder to staff because they were open, every day and for a longer length of time. Again, they reached out for help, and again, our firefighters responded. And to the point of, $350,000 was reimbursed from the state complete 100% reimbursement. So, I mean, you break that down into hours, and that's how many hours our firefighters staff these clinics when they needed to. So.
Councilor Cook and Councilor Tabor.
Thank you, Your Honor, and thank you, Chief. Really appreciate you outlining everything tonight for us. I actually received a request, or a question from a resident on a third-party ambulance billing and how that works in our system. And so I'm curious how that works for our residents. And I'm also curious what the differential is on the cost for providing EMS service versus incoming reimbursement for EMS service. If we know that, if you know, I don't know, if the budget doesn't seem to be broken down into fire versus EMS.
It's not. I mean, all of our. Let's see how I can explain this and answer the question. All of our firefighters are EMS personnel as well. Everybody at the end of their year of probation, everybody can do every job in the department, whether it's on an ambulance or an engine or not. So, to quantify the cost of an ambulance run or a response is very hard to do because, I mean, essentially we're there already. Okay. Does that help? I mean, I guess I can't really put a number on, I mean, we can look at how much it costs to what each firefighter on that ambulance is paid, I guess, per day. However, they're also firefighters. They're responding to fire calls and other emergencies as well as EMS runs as well. So it's hard to put a number on, exactly how much that costs. As far as the billing, the average ambulance call, if they do anything at all, meaning any monitoring or any intervention whatsoever, it's roughly around $1,200. And that gets billed through, again, this third-party biller. And then if they don't pay, then it goes to collection.
Thank you. I guess I'll clarify, is it safe to assume that the incoming receipts for payment for EMS services really don't cover our costs for EMS, providing EMS service?
I would say it doesn't cover the entire cost, no. But it's the service that's provided, and I don't want it to. I put that slide in there just to show that we do generate revenue for the city, but I don't want us to become a revenue generating department. That's not why we're here. We're here to provide that EMS service to the citizens of the city. There are some cities that have a separate private ambulance company do that, and that, I can tell you, costs a lot more than having firefighters who are already here do that service. Does that help? Does that answer?
That does. Thank you
Better
so
answer
much.
your question?
Yes.
I think, Counselor, the most important thing the chief said was that when the ambulance arrives at the scene of a fire and/or a medical emergency, those two gentlemen, or ladies and gentlemen, can step out and become firefighters. Most importantly, they're not just sitting aside in the truck smoking a beer and having a beer. They're doing doing the work of a firefighter. So, in order for us to maintain the 13 and 14 levels that we'd like, and 15 and 16 levels that we'd like to have, it's important to think of these people are generating money, but they're also assisting in paying for the service of having them there as a fire department, as a fire officer. It really works quite well. It's a good system.
Thank you.
Oh, Councilor Tabor, sorry.
Actually, I think Councilor Cook had the same question I did. But to put a finer point on it, if we need to invest in salary upgrades, should some of that cost be borne by looking at our ambulance fees?
Not sure. I'm not sure. We did increase our ambulance fees this fiscal year. We did a study. We were part of a study that showed that we were quite below the average of what other municipalities of our size were billing. So we did increase it. And it was the largest increase that we've had that I can remember in many years. So that will increase some. But again, I hesitate for us to become a revenue generating service. We're not we're not selling a service in the EMS, in the EMS realm. We're providing that service. And really, if I'm honest, that's where we make the difference in people's lives on this job, is in the back of that ambulance, or when our men and women walk in there, with their equipment to respond to somebody's situation. Truly, that's where differences in lives are being made and saved, like literally all the time.
Absolutely. And we also should recognize that through COVID, every one of your ambulance and EMT folks, they didn't have the choice to stay home.
No, they did not.
Right there on the front line.
No, they did not. They were out there, and we spent a considerable amount of time and put all our heads together to find out how we can do that safely and keep our families safe as well. Because, we certainly didn't want to bring, that disease back to their homes. So it was a trying time for all of us at that point, before anybody really knew, what was going on and how to handle it.
Right. Thanks.
Councillor Bagley.
Just the other counselors asking about ambulances, and for the folks listening at home, could you explain the differences between the two EMT levels and paramedic?
Sure.
And the ratio that we have in the department and what our goals are?
Sure. There are 3 levels of EMS licensure in the state of New Hampshire. There's the basic EMT level, which requires about 100 hours of training, and you become a basic EMT. For an additional 100 or so hours of training, you become an advanced EMT, and that gives you more clinical latitude as far as treatment. You have better diagnostic skills, better patient assessment skills, and there's a few more medicines that you can administer. And then for an additional 2,000 to 2,500 hours of training, you can become a paramedic, and that pretty much opens up the entire toolbox for you, and you're acting not completely the same as an emergency room physician out in the field, but there are a lot of things that you can do as a paramedic that will get done to you if not in the field, in the hospital by the emergency room physician. It's got to be 30 or 40 different medicines that are allowed to be administered, and procedures, intubations, and so on that that paramedics are able to do. And over half of our staff are trained to the level of paramedic. We have at least 2 on duty every day as a minimum. And oftentimes it's 4 or 5 or 6 even. So, and we have people in school for paramedic all the time.
Thank you.
May I do something there?
Commissioner.
Often you hear the police response or the fire response, and one of the ones that I'm probably the most proud of is when another town or another city or even the county or Air Force Base or another service provider asks for a Portsmouth ambulance to do a paramedic transfer. In other words, they want to do our ambulance to meet with their ambulance with the patient on board to satisfy the opportunity of saving this life, because they don't have the ability to do it, but our people do. It makes me proud every time I hear it. So just want you folks to know it does happen, and it happens a lot as these generations getting older, and none of us here are, but.
Thanks, Commissioner. I agree. Are there any other questions, the council? Well, Chief Germain and Commissioner Gamester, thank you for coming before and explaining the budget. I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to publicly thank you for the work that you've done over the last couple of years, certainly since you become chief. But I remember selfishly being able to get a COVID shot when I needed one, but also any time that there would be somebody that was worried or needed help, you were a phone call away to make that happen. I know that that's not easy, but it's appreciated. And I would, one of the goals has been getting up to 15, and I think that maybe a lesser leader would have gotten there already, because he would have lowered the standards of the fire department. You have not. You've held those standards incredibly high, and you've asked and expected a lot of your department, and that's something that we are thankful for in the city of Portsmouth, for the example that you've shown and that you lead with, and so appreciate all the hard work and the effort that went into presenting this budget to us.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and to your point of holding standards, we've had, just in the time that I've been chief, I've had to let go 8 firefighters on probation because they weren't meeting the minimum competencies that are expected, that I expect of them to be a firefighter in the city. And to your point, I would rather cover the vacancies and not get to those minimums than have, firefighters that just aren't meeting the standard, because it puts our citizens in danger, and it endangers the firefighters that they work with who are protecting those citizens. So thank you for mentioning that, because it's not easy to do, to look someone in the face and tell them that they're just not good enough. And
But as you hear the chief say from time to time, that's not going to happen under my watch.
Yeah.
He's very good at it. Very good at it.
Well, thank you both again for coming here tonight, and it's appreciated the work that goes in. A couple of numbers represent all the people and work that you do over a year, and it's hard to encapsulate all that, but I thought you've done a good job, and Portsmouth is grateful for the service and explaining the service here tonight with numbers.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you,
folks. Have a nice night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How's your team doing?
Good.
Did they win, Rich? They were
We're
down.
down 3-1 when I left, but I have faith. I believe. I've taught them all the tricks. They know what to do.
11 and 12-year-olds.
Yes.
We want to advertise that when you leave, they got a better shot of
Their
winning.
rally caps on.
Good for you, Rich.
Thank you.
All right, let's see. Next up, I believe we have public comment. So we're all set with the fire, so appreciate that. You're welcome to stick around for public comment, but we'd ask that anyone that wants to speak to come up to the microphone, and please do so.
Petra Huda, 280 South Street. I have mostly questions, not comments.
Fair enough.
Hopefully, it will help facilitate things. First thing I'd like to remind you is I do not have the data that you have. My questions are going to be related to the budget book, the data that I do have, and that's how the questions are going to come forward, and I will recite these by page so everybody could follow along and see where I'm coming from. My first question is, of course, I'm going to address the elephant in the room, the increase that is outside of it appears that it's outside of the collective bargaining agreements. So my question is, and I just want to state before I say anything else, I am not saying I don't support this and I don't support the purpose. I'm trying to understand the process here and where we're coming from. So my question is, the increases that are listed on the bottom of the budget, they're about a little over $500,000, and from what I'm reading on here, it's increased costs associated with medical and dental. Federal retirement obligations, this is on page 5, have increased. We're looking for additional personnel, and this is the one I'm trying to understand. It says a step increase for all personnel, not yet at the top step. And then 2.05 COLA, six unions that have previously settled a contract. So my question is, you're listing this as outside of the collective bargaining agreements. Is that how this is working? So both Fire and Police Commission came and recommended increases based on the data that you obviously have. Is this going to be included or negotiated within those agreements later, or is this kind of outside setting a precedent here? So that's my main question. And the other question here is, you have a step increase for all personnel. Last night, during the presentation, the city manager mentioned this was only police and fire. So I'm trying to understand the difference between only police and fire or all. Is it really all? So that's my first question. Next, I'm going to ask, I guess I'll go to police. In the police position detail, there was 2 positions on page 283 at the bottom that were unfunded, a captain and a sergeant. And we just saw recently in the Herald that we had quite a few promotions. Was this included in here, or did this go to print before that those occurrences happened? So that's my first question. My next question is on the next page, page 282. On the requests are for 2 patrol officers and then a clerk admin. And on that page at the bottom, it says we have a crime analyst. So my question is this a crime analyst 2? Or is this the same one? Or do they include it in here? I don't know if the page helped you on that one. My next question is on software. On page 291, and this is still in police, per the mayor's question on moving to Microsoft Outlook, can we combine those services with the rest of the IT department, especially since we will be increasing the IT department? But going down on to line computer software and maintenance, we've seen an increase in this line over the last couple of years. In 21 from 66,000 up to the new budget is 200,869. So when we get the new upgrade of the new prime system, will that affect this, and will it bring that down? Because it seems to be just still, we're going to put money out for a new system, so will the computer maintenance of the old system go down? Last question is on the CIP. The police department presented, they had $400,000 over 2 years. And basically this is still for mold remediation. I guess my question is the mold remediation still happening? And how is it going? What's the status? On the last thing for police, I will go to the rolling stock. And the request is for 4 Explorers, and it's going to come out of ARPA funds this time. It's on page 23, sorry. And then back in the rolling stock on I-11, these Crown Vics, they keep coming back. Last year, they requested, it was city ID number 2, and it was for Crown Victoria, but they purchased instead an Explorer that was listed above that. And the other Crown Vic is past its prime, obviously with useful life, but they're not asking for a replacement, and I guess that was answered tonight by they're hard to find. So that would be my question on that. There also was one included that that wasn't quite to the end of its useful life that would be included this year. So the question on that one would be, is it really a necessary addition? On fire, I really don't have any questions. I think it's great. And the only question I would have is, do we see the revenue, where do we see the revenue coming in from the ambulance? Obviously, this is replacing an ambulance here, but it's not listed in the, does it run through the general fund instead? Yeah. The other thing I remember from last year, we were trying to put money away for our third ambulance, and I was wondering about what the status of that was, if we're still trying to do that and upgrade at the third station. And that's my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Esther Kennedy, 41 Pickering Ave. I kind of had an overview question. I wasn't able to attend last night, but last night it looked like the public hearing was closed. And over the years, we have always voted to keep it open so that at the end of this process where we actually learn about the budget and hear what people have to say, there's an opportunity to have a public comment. So I don't know what Bob would say, the attorney, but I would encourage you folks to find a way to have a public comment session after you do all this work so the public can speak, because I think people were depending on that because it's happened every year, and last night I heard the gavel go down. So I would encourage that. I have, over the years, always watched our health insurance, and I guess my questions are, it's down. They gave us a health insurance 2.3 according to the information we received online, which is lower than last year's. I want to thank the fire department for admitting that they were overstaffed by a half position. So if you take the fire, there shouldn't be an increase in health insurance, and yet there is. So I guess I would love to hear where that's coming from. And again, I'd like to thank the fire department for coming down for $29,000 and having no increase in staff. For the police and the fire, I'm a firm believer we should give credit where credit's due. We heard the chief tonight say that they brought in $360-some thousand for federal funds for what they did for COVID. Yet you didn't see that tonight. You saw the ambulance revenues, and that's a small portion. I am curious what we are bringing in those federal funds to those departments, the police and the fire. I think we need to start looking at revenue, folks. You're up $10 million. And what you need to do is find the offsetting revenue for that. And I know I commend the chief by saying we're not here for the money. I hear that. But I think there is ways to look at the funding and also celebrate who is bringing that funding in. We should be doing it. And I could not find in the budget where the revenues of the federal revenues were coming in. Actually, there was only comments of state, local, and whatnot. So I would encourage that. In the police department, I didn't hear why the contracted services were up by 28%. Now, there is a study that, a really thorough study that was done on the police department not too long ago. I would encourage that you get a copy of that, dust off, bring it off the shelf, and you get a copy of that. It talked about what the needs were of the police department. It talked about, and there was a lot of money spent on that study, and it talked about what the officer, we have only gone up 342 individuals in this city. Now, with that said, I know we've gone up with our hotels and our lodging. So I guess my question to you all is, what is the adequate number for our population? And I know when I looked at it not too long ago, we were there. So I would encourage you to find the data and to look at that data and to really say what our needs are based on the data. I understand the mental health crisis, and I respect the assistant mayor. I think many police departments are going to a more therapeutic approach, where they're having social workers or other kind of behaviorists supporting some of our mental health individuals in our communities. And I don't believe our community is any different. We are definitely seen it all after our COVID pandemic. I heard Councilor Bagley bring up school resources. I think that is a great place. I have never seen a lot of, that's something that we should work on as a city. Again, it's the mental health and supporting those. If we were going to do some extras, I think maybe we want to be proactive and start looking at it that way. And I also know the federal funds can be used for that. And I don't see anywhere what we're using our federal funds for. So I know $2 million was given back to the schools. I know that we're getting quite a big chunk for the city. And I guess my question to you all is, what are you using it for? So I would encourage you to think about all those things and really look at that. I'm really curious why the insurance went up when the insurance rate went down. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Any other speakers? With that, I will adjourn this meeting. I will call out that there will be opportunity for public comment. There's also a public dialogue session on the 19th where it will be more of a question and answer interactive format. But I will also talk to Bob in terms of having an additional public hearing. That would have been an oversight by myself, not to vote to extend that. So we'll have that. Our goal is to have as much opportunity for the public to speak, and I know that there will be people that are tuning in tonight that will want to speak on other topics outside of public safety. So look forward to that. But with that, I will adjourn the meeting and have a great night, Portsmouth. Thank you.
Thank you.